Hello everyone, Ace here, and today I've got yet another historical video for you all, as this time we'll be talking about the Battle of Ridgeway, which itself was the high watermark for the Irish-American invasion of Canada, which occurred following the American Civil War. But I do believe we are getting a bit ahead of ourselves, so I do believe some backstory is necessary here. For a start, as I'm sure you are all well aware, Ireland at the time was under British control, something that the Irish people weren't exactly the most happy with, especially given the fact that by the time the battle occurred in 1866, the Irish potato famine was still very much within living memory. And in addition to this particular famine, many Irish citizens migrated to the United States, making up a notable portion of not just that nation's overall population, but also in particular its armed forces during the time of the American Civil War. After the war, not only did many of these individuals gain valuable combat experience, but it should also be noted that the conflict itself produced a considerable surplus of military supplies and equipment. This, combined with the still present desire for many Irish Americans to see Ireland itself liberated from the British, resulted in one of the strangest and most aggressive plots of all time to gain Irish independence. Specifically, the plan was for the Irish Americans to create an army among themselves to then invade and capture Canada, holding it to ransom in exchange for Irish independence. Now, as purely insane as this idea may seem on paper, it did actually seem to resonate with Irish Americans far more than it had any right to, as they appeared to have actually been able to amass no less than 10,000 supporters. Many of them, as I've already mentioned, were seasoned veterans of the American Civil War. In addition, it would appear that they were also able to procure enough supplies to arm an additional 10,000 men for a total strength of 20,000. Which is actually comparable to the force that the British and Canadians would send to defeat these Irish invaders at Ridgeway. In addition, it should also be noted that despite the extreme size of Canada, it should also be noted that the vast majority of her population existed fairly close to the US border. In other words, had this group been able to establish a foothold, they might have actually posed a far greater threat than first realized. Now, obviously, the British government knew what was going on more or less, but there was very little they could actually do about it, as the conspirators themselves weren't even in British territory, and therefore they had to rely on the United States government. And to their credit, the United States government did at least officially try to stop or suppress the activities of this particular group, known as the Fenian Brotherhood, but ultimately it would be unsuccessful at least by the time of the Battle of Ridgeway itself in 1866, which started on June the 1st of 1866, with the invasion itself beginning with a vanguard force of around 1,000 Fenians crossing the Niagara River into Canada, which quickly occupied the undefended town of Fort Erie, seizing supplies and sabotaging lines of communications along the way. In response, the Canadian authorities mobilized some 22,000 militia, as well as several formations of British regulars to counter and drive back the Fenians. On the 2nd of June of 1866, two Canadian militia battalions, comprised of a total of 850 men under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Booker, discovered a detachment of roughly 600 Fenians who had moved west to Ridgeway. Despite having been issued implicit orders instructing him to avoid contact with the Fenians and instead join up with the main body of Canadian forces, Lieutenant Colonel Booker decided to lead his numerically superior Canadian militia into battle against the Fenians, which at first the battle appeared to be favoring the Canadians, as they were successful in driving back Fenian skirmishers. However, at one point during the battle, chaos and disorganization began to spread within the Canadian ranks. It's not entirely clear what exactly caused this incident to occur. However, it is known that the Fenian force, led by a one John O'Neill, a former US cavalry officer and veteran of the Civil War, decided to make the most of the situation by performing a bayonet charge, which quickly routed the Canadian militia and handed the Fenians a victory. That said, the gains from this victory were relatively short-lived. The Fenians, now fearing a counterattack being led by British regulars, decided to quickly retire. On their way, they did end up attacking and securing the town of Fort Erie yet again. However, the Canadians were shortly after ultimately able to drive the Fenians back across the border into the US, most of whom were captured by US authorities in the process, and then later released on the grounds that they returned to their home states and not try to invade Canada again. In terms of casualties, it was reported that the Canadians lost around 9 men killed in action, with an additional 33 wounded, 4 of whom would later die of their wounds. The data for the Fenian forces, by contrast, is harder to get a hold of. However, the estimates appear to be around 14 killed. Now, as you may have guessed, the Fenians themselves actually returned home as heroes, at least to their fellow Fenian Brotherhood members. Unfortunately, the same could not be said for the Canadian forces that had taken part in the battle. In fact, despite disobeying implicit orders not to engage the Fenians, Lieutenant Colonel Booker himself was ultimately cleared of all wrongdoing, and instead, the blame for the defeat itself ultimately was laid upon the Canadian militiamen that he commanded. And this blame, I would have to argue, is extremely unwarranted. The truth is that the Canadian militia at the time was simply not well prepared. In fact, of the troops that actively participated in the battle, only around half of them had ever even actually used their rifles with live ammunition during training. It should also be noted that as a result, the Canadian government actively shunned the veterans that took part in the battle for decades afterwards. In fact, the treatment that these veterans had received from their own government was so terrible that protests were held annually on June the 2nd, the anniversary of the battle, for many years, ultimately resulting in it becoming a national holiday known as Decoration Day in Canada. Now, I should mention that the Battle for Ridgeway wasn't the end of the Fenian raids on Canada. In fact, attempted invasions would continue into the early 1870s. However, Ridgeway was clearly the high watermark of these efforts, as none of the other raids were anywhere near as successful. With that being said, I do of course hope that this particular historical video was at least interesting to you all. And I do of course still plan to make more of these videos in the near future. But in any case, this has been Ace. Hope to see you guys again soon. Take care. Ace out.